This is the Rate of Rise series brought to you by Keys to the Shop and Roast Magazine. Today we're talking with Mike Ebert about how to roast for new processing methods. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DiFurio with Keys to the Shop. Welcome to this 14th episode in the series called Rate of Rise, Elevated Conversations on Roasting, brought to you by Roast Magazine. Roast Magazine is one of the longest-running and most respected trade journals in the entire coffee industry. If you want to keep up with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the industry, then you need to be subscribed to Roast Magazine. The craft and the science of roasting is an ever-expanding field, and Roast Magazine is leading the charge, providing the most up-to-date and useful information you can have to thrive as a coffee roaster. Go to roastmagazine.com and subscribe today. And when you subscribe, you can use the code RoR, and you get $5 off your subscription to Roast Magazine. Again, if you want to resource yourself with the best in knowledge and insights in roasting, then you need to be subscribed to Roast Magazine. Check them out over at roastmagazine.com. Okay, everybody. Well, today we are going to be talking with a returning guest to the Rate of Rise series, Mike Ebert. Mike Ebert is the founder of Firedancer Coffee Consultants, and he is dedicated to helping clients create a personalized strategy to ensure long-term success through all of his consulting client work. He works primarily with roasters, producers, and retailers, drawing from his really extensive experience in all facets of the specialty coffee supply chain to guide you in reaching your potential. Mike is an Authorized SCA Trainer, holding the professional level certifications in green coffee, sensory skills, roasting, and brewing, and he has had a hand in many positions up and down the supply chain. And he continues his volunteer work with the SCA Education Advisory Council as the co-chair for the Education Content Committee. And today, Mike and I are going to talk about something that he covered in a lecture that he gave during the SCA Expo in Boston, and that is how to approach and roast emerging processing methods and the challenges that those kinds of processing methods that we hear so much about present to the roaster, and ways you should think about them, techniques that you should use in roasting, things to consider regarding the science of what happens with sugars in those coffees and beyond. We get into some really great insights and frameworks that will help you as you start to purchase some of these coffees and want to and need to pivot some of your practices to and adjust for roasting them as best as possible, as early as possible in the process as you're kind of dialing in your process. So there's a lot to talk about here. So I hope that you find this to be an episode of Rate of Rise that helps equip you for success. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation on how to roast for new processing methods with Mike Ebert. Mike Ebert, welcome back to Keys to the Shop and Rate of Rise. How are you?
I am good. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it was great to see you at Expo, and I'm excited to talk about a topic that you actually presented on at Expo, and that is roasting for different kinds of processing methods, and not the typical kind of processing methods, but I'm sure it's a question that roasters have a lot more these days. We've been familiar with traditional, well, this is washed, this is natural, I know how to handle that, but I'm sure there's some unique challenges that have emerged, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, I'm sure. So I would invite you to just kind of give us the landscape of how this has turned into a conversation in the roasting community, and what are the main concerns?
Yeah, well, really, it started with my own frustration, my own kind of feeling like I had missed something along the way. I've been roasting 37 years, and early in my career, and I think most would agree with us, wash coffee, or I'm going to refer to it as parchment dried as well. I go back and forth, and I'll explain that in a little second. But it was pretty much considered the specialty coffee, maybe a little loosely, but naturals. In fact, when I cup naturals, or I get any hint of fruit in a cup, I still have this old importer in my ear going, "Don't buy it. There's fruit. That's going to ferment and be bad." Even to this day. And at the time, they weren't incorrect. I mean, naturals were kind of, I want to say the black eye, but they weren't appreciated. And so fast forward till, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago, and now naturals are, almost a showpiece, those fruit notes and that, and all that. And naturals, even though it's a different processing method, they roast differently, but they're consistent. You can kind of understand what's going on and the reasons why. And this was a conversation as I've been teaching more and the like, PulpNaturals and honey, even when I was running roasteries, were just starting to kind of come into light, so to speak. And we didn't do many of them, and I can't even tell you, looking back then, whether I did them well. I just knew they were different, and okay, we turned them green to brown. But now I'm teaching classes, and people are asking questions. Why are they so uneven up the first crack? And I began to notice as I was roasting them for classes that I was doing the same thing. I'm screwing this one up. I got to do something. And so I began to reach out for some of my living legends in the roasting world, the Chris Schoolies and the Paul Thorntons, and people I've known for years. And they all some had the bravado of like, oh, a piece of cake, but you can hear in their voice that they were going through the same thing I was. And then others, kind of the same thing, were like, yeah, they're really. And then we began talking approaches, and like I didn't find one that went, oh yeah, that's it. It confused me even more. So that's what kind of led to this. This is actually, I did the one in Boston, and I also did one for an online event we did with Dietrich at the end of early 2021, just as a way to interact with people, so to speak. And it's evolving. And even after this one, I came away with a whole new set of questions and a whole new set of stuff I got to research on. So it really started with my own being perplexed by them, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, I think that's how a lot of these things evolve, right? And so you alluded to this in terms of the kind of question you received, like why for the honey process is this uneven at first crack, and the questions like that. Are there common questions that fit into fixed categories right now when you present this, as in here's this family of processing method, and here are the likely suspects of challenges that you're going to face that maybe you're not prepared for, and how do those break down? Like, how do you present those frequently asked questions categorically to people around new processing methods?
Yeah, really, it's right now really focused more on what I would call the PulpNaturals / the honey coffees. So, little quick review, and we all understand what washed, I called it parchment dried, because this is a new SCA term where we're referring to the state the seed was in when we dried it. So we took all the pectin and the pulp off the parchment. We dried it to 12% in that way. And then natural, where we just natural, we fruit dried. We put it on the ground and dried. So down to 12%. And honey or PulpNaturals, we're leaving that pectin on, but it's not an even coat around the parchment. It's uneven. Where always naturals versus washed. I've always, naturals tend to go through their color changes, have a fairly pronounced first crack, so they're similar to washed, but, a little lower charge temps, because you've got all that sucrose generally that has dried around that, so it's more prone to scorching. But you alleviate that pretty simply. Lower charge temps, not as aggressive energy bumps, and, you're a little gentler with it, but the process is kind of the same. Now, there's a cup quality where we tend to naturals want to focus on that fruit, so we may not take them as dark as we do others, but generally they're straightforward. With honeys and PulpNaturals in the same family, that sugar was dried, that pectin around that parchment, not evenly. It's because it doesn't come off that way when you pulp it. And if it's helpful, I can send you some photos of different shots of it. And that's my suspicion, or I can't say it's science, is why as it starts to brown, that sugar starts to brown a little quicker in some places than others, because there's more of it. So it's a little bit more prone to it. And even the other thing that I find with them is that you tend to roast them. You think you've roasted them dark, and you haven't. They look darker than they appear sometimes. So usually it's a twofold why, and I think it's because of that pectin. And it's, well, how do you approach that? And there's not a science. One of the approaches that I advise is very similar to how I might roast I'm sure you're familiar with Yemen coffees. They can be beautiful coffees, but from a processing standpoint, they're often many sizes mixed, many different densities. They're a little rougher than some coffees. So the approach I use is a slower drying phase. So before you start any chemical changes, you lengthen that a little bit to try to get them to all start browning, start yellowing at the same time. But then you're behind the 8 ball. So in order to slow that, you've had a lower charge temp. You've done other things to kind of lengthen that stage. So now you got to kick it with a little bit more energy. But typically, instead of waiting to first crack to do something to dial it back to get control of it as it has into first crack, you got to be preemptive. You got to think before first crack. And the fear with that, and what I've run into is in playing with it, is that you do it too soon, you stall. And that's getting into, various terms known as flicking or whatever, where you're actually kind of baking. And in some cases, if it happens at first crack, you're not going to push it into further chemical changes. So it's going to taste a little flat, a little, so it's one of the few that it's like all roasting I recommend. Know your roaster, know your coffee, sample roast, learn, experiment, try crazy things. Oh, that didn't work. This one's even that on steroids. Like, you've really got to, know your roaster, what your limits are of too much heat, too little heat, and then really know that coffee. It's all, I think, setting a profile for any coffee, a little sample roasting, or as we talked, I think in one of my last sessions with you, illustrative roasting, which is, okay, what is the potential of this coffee? With honeys, I find it even more valuable, or you almost don't have a choice because you're so unfamiliar with it and what might happen to it, that you've got to kind of play with it to understand, what are the color changes? What are the times I'm looking for that? How drastic? In some cases, I've had wonderful tasting honeys that look like it's a light roast and dark roast because of the whole process.
All of this makes me kind of feel like people would move away from honey processed coffees, or a coffee that has more of that pectin on it, and these varying natural processed coffees, because of the inconsistencies that it presents, that they're it makes it harder on them. But it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like they're just growing in popularity. Is this something that we are evolving to roast better, or are we just roasting it not as great, but we just want to keep the trend up?
That's a very good question, and I get asked that a lot in classes. And is this something to pay attention to? It is growing, and I look at it a couple different ways. Are we really roasting them bad, or is it just different? And so we're getting our head around it, because I've had, honey / PulpNaturals that are just awesome in the cup. Sometimes I find naturals and washed, I like that fruit, but sometimes there's too much of it, where it's, okay, I get the blueberry, but I get nothing else. I get, done with one cup and I don't really want another cup. Sometimes washed are a little bit, there's more nuances and stuff there, but I want a little bit more, kind of character to it. And so does PulpNatural honey kind of bridge that gap between both? I think that's why it's growing in popularity. Additionally, it's always that point of differentiation. People are looking for something different that the other roaster doesn't have, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. And this one, I think it's a good thing, both for a farmer being able to offer, different sensorial attributes in the cup with coffee grown at the same farm. It's a little less water intensive than washed. So, that's another advantage. But I sometimes do worry, is it just that point of differentiation, just for the sake of being different? I alluded to dark roast. I'm not a hater of dark roast. I think a well-developed dark roast is a lost art, something that still maintains some of the character of the origin, but gives you those dark roast flavors, the dark chocolates and the, spices and things like that. Then I often get asked, where did dark roast? Why did like Pete's and Starbucks and all them start down that path? And I don't really know. I met Alfred Pete once years ago. His tagline was always, specialty coffee is the quickest time from roast to consumer, which we now know has evolved quite a bit, but it's still somewhat apropos. But I really believe he didn't sit down so many years ago and roast these coffee all these different ways and say, ooh, the dark roast is the best articulation of flavor. I think it was access to good coffee wasn't available as much back then. I think it was a point of differentiation. Who else was roasting like that? We were trying to get more per pound for our coffee. So, ooh, look at this dark, oily, a little bit misunderstood, but it was a point of differentiation. So what I'm wondering is that what is it really, are we just trying to be different? And is it good? Well, in this case, I remember the mid 90s running a company called Gloria Jeans. We were chasing Starbucks and Pete's. And I started thinking, no, I like more medium roast coffees. I think there's more flavor. My family, my friends, coworkers, franchisees were better. And we're being different than everyone else. Now I think it was a good thing. Now you got roasters doing even lighter and lighter. Sometimes I go sweet sour, but I have tasted things in coffee I've never tasted before. So it's that fine line between, is it just different? Or is it different and good? And on this one, I don't think it's a bad thing.
So in some sense, it's like novelty. And when I hear you talk about this, I feel like there's this novelty of where you say blueberry and nothing else, or the defining characteristics of a special process is the flavor of the process itself, but maybe not a lot of nuance past that, because the psychological energy we have for the coffee is based on standing out. And so I wonder, as a question to continue talking about here, is when we roast special processes, is there a tendency to call victory too early because we can detect the process but we haven't pulled out the nuance?
I think that I'm stealing that line. I'll give you credit in the small print of my classes. No, I think that's a perfect way of kind of describing it at the moment. And we're only focused right now, our conversation so far has been on those PulpNatural and honeys, which I do feel are they fit into this conversation that I'm having and this kind of discussion on, how do we roast them differently? In the little lecture I gave, I've added a bunch of other new processing methods that don't quite fall into that category. Some have been around. Double wash, famous in Kenya. It's really just a double fermentation, if you will. And then there's, things like carbonic maceration, where you're putting the whole cherry in water to get it to ferment from the inside out. And a lot of those, the sensorial attributes aren't changed by necessarily how we're drying it. It's the fermentation process they go through, but they're not necessarily roasted differently. However, just this last class, I kind of brought it up in the middle of it, or last lecture, where I, made the comment, well, who's famous for double washed? And, everyone raised their hand, well, not everyone, but a lot said Kenya. And I began to think about Kenya. It's always one of my favorite coffees, and do I actually roast them differently? And I haven't come to a conclusion yet, Chris. I'm still battling that in my head, but I do think I attack them with a different energy and flow, because I don't want to say because they can take it, but no, I guess that's what I'm saying. I guess I do roast them differently, and it is because of that processing method, I think. But this is the unknown science that we don't really know. How chemically are they different, and what does that mean in the cup?
And how much are we, unintentionally sort of breeding these coffees through the roasting process to create these flavors that are the hallmarks of the coffees, and where the coffee might itself, I don't know, it sounds very metaphysical, like the coffee wants something. The coffee has in it these characteristics that go beyond the things that we love about that coffee, and we never tap into it because we've categorized it as delivering this. Like Ethiopian coffees always give us this. This is why we buy them. So we're never really surprised by those attributes, because we're not allowing ourselves to explore those attributes of the coffee based on our preconceived notions of what we want the coffee to give us. And so I guess that kind of comes back to a question that is focused. This conversation is focused on, which is, how do you determine your goal in roasting a coffee when the value proposition of that coffee is the flavor itself? Like, it seems like you're just starting by narrowing the scope of what's possible with the coffee and therefore limiting your ability to even know how to roast it to begin with.
That just blew my mind. Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.
No. Well, first off, and I think we kind of talked about this maybe the last time, but I've mentioned this a lot. Every class, everyone, I teach a lot of roasting, and they want to know the secret, and tell them there is none. There is no objective way to measure degree of roast that exists in the coffee world. There's the Q, but that's a specific roast file for sample roasting for buying, but when you see any roast ranking, and I'm not knocking anybody who does it, we haven't agreed upon that. We tried for years. It was, if you remember the roasters, I think it was called the Roaster's Choice, where you as a roaster could submit samples to the Roasters Guild Council. It was after I was on the Roasters Guild, and they picked the top 10. They'd put them out by the barista competition, and they'd pick a winner. Well, it went away for a couple of reasons. And one of them is we kind of had this honest conversation of how do we rate roast, quality. There's some defects, but even the defect baking, which has long been, kind of explained as too long of a time, too low of a temperature where you flatten, you're not getting the acidity or the brightness. I would argue that most roasters who do a really great espresso are baking it. Now, not to a point where it's I don't want to make that as negative, but what we're trying to do is we're lengthening the development time a little bit. We're trying to maybe not take it as dark as we used to, because we want to tame that acidity. We're getting it to play well in a shot of espresso where it's so intense. So technically that's baking to some degree. So anyway, we don't have this way of really ranking roast degree. I know a roaster in Northern California, you've probably heard of him, Mr. Espresso, who breaks almost every rule I know of. He's got an over 20-minute roast of espresso, and it is delicious. So I kind of take it with a grain of salt. But what I've always wondered is there more we need to know about the chemical makeup of what's in a coffee, where we could look at that and still won't give us, how can I put this, the recipe, but more, here's what's available in there. Here are the approaches you might take that may highlight what's in there.
I think it's great to have a goal and have, you have a menu, you need a coffee that fills a niche of chocolatey, nutty. That's fine. But when we're talking about this, I'm thinking, if we're having to approach new processing methods or emerging processing methods with different tools or understandings, how do we create an opportunity to have this increase our capacity as roasters for other coffees? So, like, how do you take the exercise of roasting a pulp natural coffee and then take the lessons you learn and the chops you build doing that and put that over onto the coffees that you're used to, become a better roaster of a washed Guatemalan coffee, et cetera? Or are these skills going to simply be only applied to these special processing methods? Then I suppose if you just have a reductive, thought process about coffee roasting, then maybe you won't think about how to transfer those skills are transferable. But I'm wondering if you've seen roasters that have to deal with more variety in processing methods generally become better roasters of traditional processing methods.
I can't say I've seen it, but it really goes back to what I was just saying. It's really hard to quantify. Are they better, or what is better when you can't quantify the end product in a very objective manner? But I believe that to be very true. There are, this example, and I won't name names or anything, of course, but I've had certain lots of coffee that I know multiple roasters have. It's from an importer that I know other roasters are buying, and I'm always curious as to, that's what I bought. How did they approach it? Okay, and I learned things that way. And most of these are traditional, washed or natural. They're not some new crazy where I'm not going, oh, that's both roast and that's something they did, chemically in that bean while it dried, which blows my mind. But going back to that I've had the particular coffee where I've roasted it and thought I'd done a good job. I've had it same lot from somebody else, and wow, how did they get that out of it? And it makes me go back and wonder, wow, maybe because I don't want to say dumbed down my washed coffee methodology in roasting, but I actually haven't overthought it for years. I kind of almost feel like, what's there to learn there? And I think you bring up a good point that maybe we haven't.
I'm curious to kind of draw this back to some practical applications for people who do bring in these coffees and want to do well and not waste a lot of time. There's going to be experimenting, of course, but it's kind of disconcerting to think that you're going to be experimenting all the way through a bag or two of coffee before you get a good taste from it. So you mentioned, for instance, this slower development time in the beginning, this drying phase to get everyone started on the same foot, everyone being the beans, all the beans. What other techniques are there that you think people should utilize when they're approaching more finicky emerging processed coffees like this?
I'll go through kind of my list that I talk about in the lecture. The first one is what we just talked about, is lower thermal energy. Not only to be gentler, but really it allows you to have a little bit more control as it progresses. Okay, because technically up until yellow, when we get into the Maillard reaction, okay, we haven't really changed anything chemically. We've lost some water. It's known as the drying phase, even though not all of the water is gone. That's what's responsible for first crack. But technically, you can make the argument that phase could be 6 minutes or 20 minutes if you repeated the rest of the roast. Coffee should taste the same. Now, that's a little bit of a lie, because if you have a 20-minute drying phase, you don't have the thermal energy to replicate any roast that you did in, a 6-minute drying phase. But the idea is gentler going into that. But it also allows, and this is more a theory than it is any kind of science. So as I developed this class, I tried to get data on what is the sugar change, because that's really what we're doing. We're breaking down sugars. We talk sweetness in coffee all the time, and it's, to me, the hallmark, the balance of sweetness is the hallmark of a good roast, a good coffee. You got to have sweetness somewhere. But why are we talking about sweetness? We degrade 99% of the sugars. It's all sweet perception. It's what we break those sugars down into. But the interesting stat, so in a lot of these new methods, there's not a lot of readily available science of the chemicals that are in, what sugars are, all that. But there is one that I found that's been backed up by a couple, that in the wash process, a lot of the fructose and glucose are theoretically washed out, for lack of a better term. They're still there, but they're very low percentage. In natural and honey or PulpNatural, those two are significantly higher by like 20 times the amount. Fructose and glucose are involved in that first Browning reaction, Maillard reaction. Sucrose is not. Sucrose comes to the party 20, 30 degrees later as we get into caramelization. So my theory here, and I'll be very clear, it's theory, and just looking at all this and roasting a lot, is that going into those chemical changes gentler, allowing a little bit more time for those fructose, maltose to break down into more things that are pleasurable. The other thing is keeping that control as you get into first crack. What I have found is that, if, let's say I'm looking at a particular time, I'm 6 minutes into my roast, and I want to be at a 28 degrees a minute rate of rise, and I'm actually at 35. I know what on all my other coffees, what I need to do to drop that. I find with honeys, they're also not always consistent, is trying to drop that rate of rise. I either plummet it too much or I don't do it enough. And I, quite honestly, I haven't quite figured out what that is, but most, whether it's washed or natural, I know, I'm at this stage. Here's what I need to drop the energy to, or here's how I need to drop the energy and air, whatever the case may be. It's really about assuring that control of your rate of rise, where as you're getting into first crack, because it's going to be too late if you don't. And most other coffees, even like washed, and this goes back to what you mentioned before, how, are we not overthinking washed because they're just kind of old school, and maybe we should be. But typically washed coffees, when I'm washing them, I give them a lot of, I don't want to say free range, but I don't overthink 5 degrees difference at a particular rate of rise at a particular time of a roast, because I know I'm going to be able to correct it with further moves, let's say. Where a honey, I tend to be, and maybe I'm overthinking it. And it's because I really want to make sure I got control going into first crack, because that's where I get that kind of not quite light roast, dark roast, but very unevenness in color, which leads to they often look darker than they really are.
So this is just a wild behavior that you're trying to tame through different methods, and I'm curious about quantifying that variable that makes them wild, the fruit sugars and that element that creates that wild card. Is there any way, or has anyone developed a way to sort of assess that, if it's like for a given process, or even if it's, just the coffee itself, is there a way to assess how much of a wild card it's going to be based on the sugar content or the process itself?
I don't believe I get maybe there could be somewhere down the road, but I don't believe there's a way that you can run it through a test or know. I think the only way is, one, to understand it's a processing method where the sugars have not been dried equally over that parchment. So it makes sense that they would brown different rates, where you get more sugar, less sugar, you'd have different colors. To me, the only solution right now is you should always sample roast in your profile roast. My whole, article about, instead of just sample roasting, illustrative roasting. I think it's even more important with these. I've spent a lot of time in the last, since I started this class, is trying to put, money where the mouth is, so to speak, and actually try some different ones and try all kinds of different techniques. Generally, what I just went through works, but what I still feel I'm missing the sweet spot on them. I always get I don't feel as complete as I do on other methods, where I'm like, yeah, there could be different ways to roast this particular wash or natural, but wow, this is delicious. I love it. And not to say I have not had delicious PulpNaturals honeys, but I always get this, and maybe it's that person in my head that's, overanalyzing to some degree. But I find I get better when I've sample roasted them before and I have something to shoot for.
Tell me about the usages of, say, we'll just choose honey, and where it fits in the typical menu of a coffee bar or roastery. Because I see, if we're going to be experimenting, and sometimes the coffees can, not that they're flat, but they have like a very distinctive note, but not as much complexity perhaps, that those would fit very well into blends to fill out that complexity. Is this typically where you see these things? Or maybe is that where they should be while we're trying to figure out how to feature them as single origins? Because sometimes I do taste some of these coffees, and it like I said earlier, it feels like I'm just tasting, and you said like tasting one note, you taste the process, but you kind of want more, which would, I guess, be okay in a blend because it's adding that element to a bunch of other things. How do you see these fitting in now, and where do you see them going in the future?
Yeah, actually, and maybe you misunderstood me, because I actually found, and no, maybe you didn't, but I haven't seen them used a lot in blends. I know some people have used them in blends. I almost find them, my comment, and maybe I confused the issue, is that naturals I love. I mean, even though I grew up being told that they're evil, not evil, but they're going to turn bad. They're going to, that ferment is that fruit's going to go to ferment or sour or vinegar,
right?
Pretty much sitting in your plant, and relatively that was true, because I always liked that fruit out, and I would, and I wasn't necessarily a listening to my boss all the time or my mentors. I would do my own thing, and sometimes learn something, sometimes go, oh, they were right. But I found sometimes, the blueberry note that we all love in Ethiopians, I've had some that are very one-dimensional. They're delicious and you get that blueberry, but there's not a lot of nuance going on. But what I found with some PulpNaturals and honey is there's that almost that perfect balance of kind of that fruit, but nuance, a little bit more clarity, not quite that body and depth where they don't need to be in a blend. At the same time, though, I'm second guessing myself. And this would be one that I'm going to start asking roasters on this, is that because sometimes those fruit bombs, we like them in our drip coffees, and we do an espresso, but you got to be very careful, because it doesn't take much of that to really just totally overpower especially something that's going to be blended more than likely with milk. But with PulpNaturals, is it going to give us that ability to have something that we can add that fruit, that kind of, and not have to be quite so careful at the level that we're what percentage we're adding in that blend, because it's not going to overpower any kind of drink that's made with it. But I have not seen, and I won't say paid a lot, but I do a lot of work where people, hey, match this blend, I really love it, or help me create espresso blends. And I'm regularly looking at blends and kind of like, oh, what's in it? How did they create that? I'm still at 37 years going, how did they, wow, that is, and trying to piece it together. And sometimes I could do it easily. Sometimes it's, wow, I don't know. Is it a processing method? Maybe I haven't heard, but I haven't seen a lot of PulpNaturals in blends, but that's not empirical research, Chris.
You mentioned the different contexts that you could find this coffee in versus, there's brewed coffee and then there's espresso. I want to think about that a little bit. How, as a roaster, do you approach PulpNaturals or these more funky processing methods when you know that the context is either one of those two things? How is there a difference in how it shows up in the cup?
I wish I could answer that. We're just beginning to explore that. It's funny you bring that up. There's not a lot in, as you might be aware, I teach a lot of roasting courses. I'm an AST, roasting, and in the area of blending in general, let's forget about espresso or drip or whatever. There's not a lot in the curriculum on it because it is very subjective. There's not a lot of science in what's the right way to blend. Should you pre-blend the green before you roast, or should you post-blend? Or I'm here to tell you, there's not one right way. It all depends on what you're looking for in the end cup. There might be two ways to get there. There may be one way to get there. And anyway, so we've been going through this. So we've been looking to build out our curriculum, whether it's an added part of our training that we offer as part of SCA curriculum, that, hey, this is a bonus section. It's not on the test, but you have to know this because blending is the number one question that, what's the science behind it? And well, there's not really, there's approaches. And that could be a whole discussion in and of itself. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but we have just embarked on, and some of this I can talk about, some of it I can't, because we're working on an app that's being used to rate espresso, rate a producer's coffee for espresso. Would it work? Would it not? And it's meant to be not a like cup score. It's meant to be a, here's the process used to prepare it. And it's a quick little, so many questions are asked. Could it work? Could it not? Could it be a percentage? And so we are doing the kind of back end work with not only ourselves, but a couple other labs and a couple other both AST, Q graders, et cetera, where we're going to put this thing through its paces. And the only way to show is it going to be something that the industry can use is we need data. So we need to do a lot of it. And so I help create this methodology of not only, okay, here's my 10 single origins that I currently carry, which could work in an espresso blend. But then once you start creating the blend, how are you rating them? Because as you know, there's not really a agreed upon methodology for scoring espresso. That's one that's a little bit, not as cut and dry as the Q, let's say. Anyway, that all said is we just started 2 months ago, and we've been traveling this whole month, but we're starting it up next week again, where we're going through the next phase of trying to quantify that. And we added, actually it came from this course, we added a whole bunch of PulpNaturals and a couple other, an anaerobic fermentation, as well as a carbonic maceration, a couple new other processing methods where they're adding different yeasts to the fermentation process, just to see what we get. I don't have results yet. So we're just embarking on that. All we've done is gone through kind of my standard, your Brazil, Colombian, bunch of other fresh central kind of approach as a starting point to get us aligned. We're now just diving into these different processing methods because, talk about another one that we didn't even mention, which is, Sumatra, Jilling Bassa, seed dried, completely different animal in the roasting process that I don't think that actually, I'm thinking of it, I should add it if I ever do this course again, is you really got to talk about that one, because Sumatra, some people love it or hate it. Done right, it'll be one of your best selling single origin drips. any company I've been with, but it's a whole different animal than any of the ones we just talked about. And then in espresso, same thing. And I've used it in espresso blends. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good.
Well, it seems like you have to weigh how much energy you're willing to devote to having a variety of approaches in your roastery. If you just want to deal with coffees that are predictable, or you want to invest in a lot of different unique approaches to like one type of coffee that requires us to be completely different in what we do, it seems attractive to just stick with coffees that all behave the same, because you don't have to invest as much energy into switching the way that you approach them.
No, I agree completely. But kind of a weird analogy, but I talk all the time to clients and students about, you have to have that conversation, even in specialty coffee, is, am I doing all this? Is the consumer going to know? Are they really going to notice the difference? Are they really going to care about this? And you have to have that conversation. At the end of the day, we still have to make money. And sometimes we do things that they're never going to know. However, my opposite to that is slope to mediocrity is a slippery slope. And if you start making every decision based on they're not going to know, they're not going to know, they're not going to know, you just become a mediocre roaster. And right now, I think with these is either they're going to go away because nobody can figure them out, or they're too even seasonality with them. I find PulpNaturals and honeys, or there could be really good for so far as year after year, but there seems to be more variability in like any, but a little bit more than others. So is that eventually going to frustrate us all, or are there going to be roasters who kind of figure that out, and that's how they differentiate themselves and become the new leaders? There's a fine line there.
Yeah. Well, it seems like back to the idea of maybe the challenges that these present are a way of keeping us sharp for the things that we take for granted.
True.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I'm excited to hear about that app, and I hope it goes well. It's really interesting. So we'll keep a lookout for that as well. Where can we find more information? I know you do workshops and consulting, and you talk about things like this all the time. So where can people learn more about what you do and information like this?
Our website, there's two of them. There's FiredancerCoffeeConsultants.com, which is our more serious, the regulatory, food safety, high-end consulting. But I would recommend going to FiredancerEducators.com, and that has a list of all our current classes. We have, the full AST track. So all 5 modules, all levels, generally all of them on our calendar, at least once a month. Obviously some of the higher classes, the pro level, only quarterly. But we also offer, now we haven't offered these in a while, we're just about to start them again, which is what we call, we're stealing an SCA term called skill building. So they're not a certified course. They may be a snippet from a course. They may be something that's above and beyond that we've learned since. This particular one I've already added to my intermediate roasting course. We've got to have this conversation. There's another course I taught at Expo, which is what we just talked about, why we talk about sweetness when we degrade 99% of it. And it's analyzing roast profiles for sweetness. And it's really, you didn't miss anything, Chris, because if you had taken it, you would have thought you'd come away with answers and you'd come away more confused. And that's kind of the intent. But, but it's, because there's different types of sweetness. There's sweet sour, there's sweet caramel, there's sweet dark chocolate, and it's all this perception thing, but it's a healthy conversation. So anyway, these skill building we offer, we're going to start offering monthly, which are just sometimes free, sometimes just a couple hours lower cost that are not as time consuming. But in our lab here in Chicago, we're outside Chicago, Schaumburg, Illinois, we'll be offering lots of those. So a little bit more accessible, not taking up a full day or 2 to 3 days. And our goal is to turn some of them online, but I think like most of us, I'm a little sick of online education. Get back to face, but I do think that there's a certain part of that that's a nice mix. That maybe there's a nice balance we can get back to. So we'll probably be adding some of those online as well.
Man, got a lot going on, but I'm really glad you do the work you do. You're always a wealth of information, Mike. Thank you so much for being a guest on Rate of Rise again.
Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure, Chris, and hope we can see you sometime soon.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope that you got a lot from this. And like I said, that you came away with some frameworks for thinking about how you might need to adjust for these new processing methods and how they behave in the roaster. And these best practices are emerging. So as you start to see better results from different techniques, you yourself will add to the collective wisdom that has been presented in talks like Mike gave. And I'm sure 2 or 3 years from now, if Mike gives the same talk, there's going to be even more to talk about, because we're going to discover a little bit more about how to control these coffees in the roaster, and we're going to get more successful with bringing the best out in the coffees, which is, after all, what roasting is all about. So thank you so much to Mike for joining us again on the show. As always, you can go visit Mike and see what he's up to over at firedancercoffee.com. And also don't forget to subscribe to Roast Magazine by going to roastmagazine.com, where you can read lots of articles that Mike has written and lots of other industry experts across the globe as well at roastmagazine.com. Thank you, everybody, so much for taking the time to join me for another Rate of Rise series. And stay tuned, because we are going to be releasing the live episodes, the live Rate of Rise interviews collected from the show floor over at SCA in Boston. We have 10 interviews with a great lineup of global thought leaders and educators in coffee, and you're not going to want to miss that. Stay tuned to Roast Magazine, at Roast Magazine on Instagram and at Keys to the Shop on Instagram, as we update when that's going to happen, and I'm really excited for that. So thanks, everybody, again, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.